Hello, class, and welcome back to Lecture 8 on genre. This is part 3, in which we will briefly discuss something of the social function of genre. What social functions does genre perform for us as members of a society? And here in our first slide, we have a still from our movie for the lesson, The Invisible Man, directed by Leigh Whannell. It's a horror film, and like many horror films, it's a commentary. And in this case, it's a commentary on the way that women are treated by men in our society. So I want you to be thinking about that so that you can write about it in your assignments. So one way of appreciating Hollywood's complex reflection of and influence on American culture is by looking at how such everyday phenomena as the family, romance, heroism, femininity, or childhood have been represented in different genres at different times. Many scholars believe that audiences like seeing the same kinds of movies over and over again because they serve as ritualized dramas that somewhat resemble holiday celebrations. Ceremonies that are satisfying because they reaffirm cultural values with little variation. And so if you think about how we celebrate Christmas every year, or how we celebrate Thanksgiving, or Easter, or any holiday, we don't vary the way we celebrate very much. It's always the same foods, the same festivities, the same music, and it's the same with genre films. We go there to get a sort of ritualized comfort at the movies. Some scholars argue that genres go further and exploit ambivalent social values and attitudes. In other words, they depict our society, reflect our society, and invite us to view ourselves. They may even go further and make a pointed commentary about society. A gangster film, for example, makes it possible for an audience to relish the gangster's swagger and to feel the pleasure of the gangster's transgression against society, the easy money, the power, while still feeling satisfied when he receives his punishment or comeuppance, right? So we get the emotional value of both the transgression and the punishment. In a negative way, a movie may exploit media-driven fears and represent Arabs as terrorists, right? Certainly, we saw a lot of this in the 80s and 90s. Even a movie like Back to the Future has Libyans as terrorists, and we just all sort of accepted that because our society and our media often told us that Arabs were terrorists, right? They didn't give us alternative, positive reflections of Arabs. We got some of that after 9/11 too, but we also started to get pushback as our society's values started to change, and we started to recognize that it wasn't right to stereotype, it wasn't right to group everybody and lump everybody into one identity. And so movies were also made that were sympathetic to Arabs and other Middle Easterners, and not just vilifying them. So that's the way that genre can provide social functions. Even in action movies or spy movies or movies that you don't seem to think maybe are very serious, they can still reflect those very serious issues. Genre conventions arouse emotions by touching on deep social uncertainties, but then channel those emotions into approved attitudes. And as I said, unfortunately, sometimes those approved attitudes are pretty uncritical on how genres represent such issues as race, class, gender, and sexuality. Right? We're still very conservative as a nation and still very traditional in the way that Hollywood, at least, represents race, gender, and sexuality. Now, things are much more progressive and diverse in television and independent cinema. But Hollywood genre heroes still, even today, tend to be mostly white men. Just think about Marvel, for example. right? It's almost all white men. There's a few women who are white, and there are a few African American sidekicks, right? Like Captain America's sidekick and Iron Man's sidekick. So how does that reflect our society? Well, it reflects a society, one could argue, in which unfair racial hierarchies have been erected that place white men at the top. So you may disagree with that, but many scholars have argued that, and you can point to a lot of examples, as I do here in the slide. Because genres are so frequently changing, and because movies get made so quickly, they often respond quickly to social trends. So, for example, Depression-era comedies often reflected social inequality. 1950s monster movies reflected fears of nuclear energy and racial integration. Recent films may be more sympathetic to LGBTQ plus characters and feature them more prominently in their narratives than films of eras past, although again you see this much more in TV and independent cinema than you do in Hollywood. It's still more or less terrified of doing anything that's not very, very traditional and conventional. And so you might get a hint of a non-straight character in a movie like Star Trek Beyond, where we see that Sulu is supposed to be gay for like 2 seconds, or Thor Ragnarok, where Valkyrie is a lesbian, but we don't really see that reflected on screen, or something like Harry Potter, where Dumbledore is supposed to be gay, but again, it's not overt in any way. Now, I do think that you'll see this changing more. I think as Hollywood doesn't fear that gay characters are going to hurt their bottom line as much, you'll see them changing. But never think that it's done for any reason other than money. Social processes can also be reflected in genres. Ripley, the female protagonist in Aliens, is a courageous, aggressive warrior who has a warm maternal side. Many scholars saw Ripley as a product of the women's movement and second wave feminism that arose out of the late 70s. Women going to work in the 80s, breaking the glass ceiling. But the 80s were also a very conservative time, a very neoconservative time, and there are a lot of cultural throwbacks to the 1950s that sort of reference the 50s as this time of idealism in terms of cultural values. And so Ripley is also seen as a mother, right? She can be a warrior as long as she's also a mother. Other scholars have argued that the aliens in the film represent a perceived threat to non-whites, that the aliens themselves actually represent otherness, blackness, brownness. Again, the film made in the very conservative 1980s sets a band of mostly white heroes against dark aliens. Such ways of looking at genre are called reflectionist because they assume that genres reflect social attitudes as if in a mirror, though many critics also feel as though this is an oversimplification. And I'm not telling you that any of the reflectionist analysis or arguments that I've used as examples in these films is quote-unquote right. It's just an example. And you're free to believe whatever you want. And you should be doing your own critical thinking about movies and making your own arguments, as long as you always base them off the evidence, right? And that's why, whether we study genre's history, its cultural functions, or its representations of social trends, that genre conventions there in the film remain our best point of departure for study. All right, next, authorship and style, Wes Anderson and the Grand Budapest Hotel.